David Paterson served as the 55th governor of New York from the resignation of Eliot Spitzer in 2008 until he walked away from the job, or some would say was pushed, at the end of 2010. But it's easy to forget that before becoming governor, Paterson had a role in state government starting in 1985 when he joined the state Senate, and that is a ton of insight and experience into how the Empire State works. And he shared some of that insight and experience with our own Dominic. Dom?
Well, Andrew, the governor's official portrait was unveiled over the weekend in Albany. Today we met with him in Harlem. Now, there are some in political circles that believe if Paterson had just appointed Caroline Kennedy to the U.S. Senate, pleasing President Obama, that Paterson would still be the governor today. We talked about Caroline Kennedy, and Paterson also has a few kind words for Rob Astorino. It's so nice to see you tonight, Governor Paterson.
Well, thank you. It's great to see you, Dominic, and I dare say you have interviewed me as much as anyone else over the years, maybe with the exception of Fred Dicker. We'll have to count him up one day.
Well, thank you, Governor. But let's go ahead and get to the issues. Let's start with the news of the day, if you will, and that's Republican County Executive, as you know, someone you know very well, Rob Astorino, running for governor. If you will, Governor, take off your partisan hat and assess Mr. Astorino as a candidate.
Rob Astorino is a very bright man. He's a great talk show host. He's one of those who did talk radio before he went into government. And I think he's a little bit better talk radio show host than me. I'm a little jealous of him. But he knows all the issues. He's not a Republican that's going to strike fear into the hearts of Democrats. But he's not going to win this election. And I know there's a poll out that says Governor Cuomo's favorability is 42%. I think that's just people's general dissatisfaction with government. Everybody's poll numbers are down. But you cannot take away from Governor Cuomo the lowering of taxes for business, marriage equality, a new pension tier 6 pension reform, education reform, support for the charter schools, $500 million support for the public schools. I could go on and on. He's lowered the temperature of discord in Albany, passed every budget on time. I see him as an overwhelming victor this year.
So, Governor Paterson, you believe Mr. Astorino can be governor of New York, just not now up against Andrew Cuomo?
One day, I think he's got all the tools to become a governor. Right now, if I were him, I would stick with talk radio.
But Governor Paterson, Mr. Astorino came just this morning to the heart of the Bronx, Democratic country.
Well, I gave him credit. He's a very smart man. If you're running as a Republican, the best way to get attention is to go into a stronghold of Democratic support and let people know that you'll be inclusive and that you'll represent all the people. And I think that he will handle himself with that same positive decorum through the campaign. I like him very much. But he's running against a man who's done some things that haven't been done in this state in 50 years. He lowered taxes to a rate lower than existed before Governor Cuomo was born, and that was 60 years ago. He passed 3 straight budgets on time. I don't think that's been done since the Peloponnesian Wars. I'm just saying there's a difference between good and great. The future will tell what Mr. Astorino can be, but right now Governor Cuomo's been great.
Governor Paterson, would you agree with this assessment? If you had appointed Caroline Kennedy to the Senate, you would still be the governor of New York?
Well, then I guess it's clear that I would never be the governor of New York today, because Caroline Kennedy dropped out of consideration a couple of days before I made a choice. So I never got to consider her among the other candidates I considered. The winner, I think, has been excellent in spite of what was said at the time, Kirsten Gillibrand.
Governor, why did you pass on Caroline Kennedy, and how close did you come to appointing her?
You know, I really don't know, because by the time I made a final decision, what I really liked about Senator Gillibrand was she was an upstater. She would become the youngest U.S. senator right after a year when young people finally voted. They got the constitutional amendment changed in 1972, but young people had not gone to the polls until the 2008 election. So I thought that was a good thing to represent. And she was, of course, a woman like Hillary Clinton, and only 15 other women were serving in the Senate at the time. And that's not nearly the representation that we should have. So she, in addition, indisputably understands the economy as well as any other U.S. senator right now, and did then. And that's why I appointed her.
Governor Paterson, the conventional wisdom at the time said Eliot Spitzer puts you on his ticket as lieutenant governor. Hillary Clinton's running for president. She's elected president, leaving an open Senate seat, and Spitzer appoints you to the U.S. Senate. So why didn't you just appoint yourself to that Senate seat to begin with?
Well, conventional wisdom was right insofar as what perhaps the overall plan was when I came to run with Governor Spitzer, but the Senate was deadlocked to the point that only in the last days before Majority Leader Malcolm Smith was sworn in 2009 was that resolved, because remember they had those three senators, what do they call themselves, the three amigos, and now they're known as the three inmates because they're all in prison. They were bouncing back and forth like tennis balls at Wimbledon, trying to get the best deal from the Republicans and the Democrats. And later on that year, two of them actually moved over and became Republicans. One became the majority leader of the Republican conference because he switched his vote and became a Republican that year. I knew that they were sitting back waiting for an opportunity to wreak more havoc on the state with what they call reform, but was really corruption. And I was not going to let them get a chance at controlling who was going to become the next governor, because if I appointed myself to the U.S. Senate, the majority leader of the Senate, since there was no lieutenant governor, would become the acting governor. And I thought they would be right back in the thick of it and would probably be billionaires by the time that resulted. And I wasn't going to allow that corruption to take place. And that's also why, when they did finally do it in deadlocking the Senate later that year, I appointed a lieutenant governor, and in spite of a vast public dicta that I wouldn't be able to sustain that appointment, the Court of Appeals upheld my decision.
Well, you know, as many times as we've talked about David Paterson and that Senate appointment, I never really considered what would have happened if he had appointed himself and there wouldn't have been a governor or a lieutenant governor. The thought that the majority leader of the Senate would have taken over, very interesting. I'm curious, Scott, clearly Governor Paterson looks like he's enjoying being out of the executive office. Something, again, the smile on your face gives me the feeling you might be doing the same thing. How do you think history is going to look back on David Paterson's time as governor?
Well, it was a very tumultuous time, if we recall. I mean, it really was crazy, the whole thing with Spitzer. And he kind of came in there, he made a joke before, as he was elected lieutenant governor. He said, all I do is I call up every morning and make sure the governor is still there, and then I go back to sleep, or something close to that. You know? But one day he wasn't there, and he had to be governor. And I think he was overwhelming. But you're right. I think, you know, if you go back and look at what's happened since and look at some of the background, that decision, even though it took a long time to make, was very critical in terms of the New York State government operations.
Mike, what goes through your mind when you think David Paterson?
I think of David Paterson stepped into a completely untenable circumstance by the recklessness of his governor and the man whose failures put him into office. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And in the aftermath of the collapse of Eliot Spitzer and the things in which he did that led to that collapse, you know, Paterson, who was not exactly, as I understood it, part of the day-to-day operations of the state under Eliot Spitzer, gets thrown this massive responsibility. At the same time, in the course of his unelected term, Hillary Clinton gets appointed as Secretary of State, and now he's got an open Senate seat on his hands. He is dealing with a press corps that he never had to deal with in a consequential way before. He decided to be a little forthright about some of his personal failings. And I just think this confluence of events and just this sort of appetite for, wow, New York really has hit an all-time low in the aftermath of Eliot Spitzer. He unfortunately, and I guess fortunate he became the governor, unfortunately that he had to sort of be responsible for this mess that he did not create and the circumstances that were not his to begin with. You know, there were some mistakes that he made. Yeah. Perhaps he was too frank with the public about some of his personal problems.
And that's a point I made to him privately. I normally don't reveal what we talk about privately, but I did ask him,
Yeah.
Governor, why do you need to tell us every detail about your personal
Yeah, well,
life?
look, you can't blame the guy. The guy who had the job before him. Look what happened. I mean, that guy's personal life was a mess. But Paterson's problems were nothing compared to what we
But
saw.
his greatest asset is his personality.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
his greatest asset
Yes.
is who he is.
Yes.
And he was sort of working on that basis. He's an affable, funny, intelligent guy, and he was just being out there. He'll get bad marks for administration, but I think in the end, people remember him as being likable.
You know, it's funny that you say that, Andrew. I just want to make this quick story. One time when I interviewed Governor Paterson, and it was on live television, and I wanted to crawl under the table and die with his reaction, because I knew the moment he said it, the tape ended up being on David Letterman's show. So that's how much I knew he had stepped in it. You mentioned his personality. It's true. He's the type of guy. He's very funny, likable, but he's very honest. And I asked him on live television about past alleged drug use, and the governor of the state of New York, the brand new governor, said, "Yes, I've tried drugs," and I expected for him to duck the question or not answer, and I didn't know what to do once he admitted that he had tried cocaine before.
Gotta stop asking these questions.
Yeah, gotta stop asking the questions.
With the president last week admitting that he used to get high. I mean, maybe the time and place.
marijuana and
It may be the time and
cocaine are
place
two
around when he
different-
took over.
I think one of the, I'm not going to give George W. Bush a lot of credit, but the one thing I give him a lot of credit for was the way he handled that question. He never answered the question, but he was very clear. He wasn't going to lie to you either. He just said, "Look, when I did irresponsible things, I did irresponsible things," and
That's what I was expecting.
and that's the kind of thing. On one hand, the public wants their politicians to just be forthright and honest, and David Paterson was to the nth degree. And sometimes, less said is better.
He's not a fan. I know you have to go to break. He is not a fan of President Obama's, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. He feels that President Obama has sold out a number of African American elected
You know what,
officials.
Dominic? I'm going to tune in for that tomorrow night because that sounds like TV I'm going to want to watch. We're going to take a break. Talk CPAC next. Stay with us.